Okay, next up is Vincent Wieland from the University of Bonn, and he will tell us about the combined statistic models for the evaluation of cancer progression from clinical data. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. Yeah, I'm Vincent. I'm from the University of Bonn, a PhD student there, and I started last year. And my main project then developed to be some kind of a collaboration with the university clinics, and they want to evaluate cancer trajectories, so cancer patient trajectories, so really look at what is the trajectory of a patient as a whole on a holistic level throughout the course of disease. And there's some challenges and shortcomings so far in the cancer research for that. So first of it, survival analysis is what you will mostly see if you look into cancer trials. Clinical trials are costly, they have a lot of ethical regulatories, so we don't want to use this kind of nice structured data because it's not available for them. They really want to use what is out there in an unstructured way when patients come in for screening, for diagnosis of cancer, for if they are in the hospital, there's a lot of routine data which is unused because it's unstructured. But this routine data contains a lot of information about various processes which are going on in the cancer patient, and we then try to combine these processes into one kind of model. So what we want to do with this first work is to look at three different processes, combine them into one, do some parameter inference for the parameters coming up there, and see whether we can explain the trajectories and really the dynamics we see in the cancer patients. Of course, this is kind of a high goal, and today I just want to present the first step towards it, and I'm also happy to get a lot of ideas from you for the next steps into that direction. So when we start, the first question is, okay, how do we model a cancer patient? And of course, there are many different things we can model, but the first three we considered as really important were first the survival of the patient. So what you will see, a patient with cancer dies at some point. This is why we want to treat them. This is why we need to develop new therapies, and we need to model them, and they die because of the disease. And this disease is characterized first of all by a tumor which grows inside a cancer patient. So here maybe the example of some breast cancer patient. This tumor size we want to describe in some way, and then the second really important characteristic of, in this case, breast cancer is that it metastasizes. So there's this famous quote, 90% of death related to cancer coming from metastasis. There's no data validating this quote, but this quote is cited a lot in cancer research. So it shows that metastasis and the spread of metastasis is really a threat on the patient's life. So it shows these two as describing the disease, and then the survival as our outcome, which we want to look at. So let's dive a bit deeper into that. So the first is modeling tumor growth. There are a bunch of models out there and a bunch of literature, but if we start simple, then tumor growth is just a continuous process. So we are modeling, for example, the size, the volume, the diameter of a tumor by some kind of differential equation. And if we take it simple as we want to, this differential equation is just an ordinary differential equation. We have one growth factor, beta, and a function which accounts for deviating from exponential growth. But the really most simple thing is, and what started in the 50s, is modeling a cancer tumor by exponential growth. So this will be the first example we consider. It has a lot of limitations, we can tell you, but it's quite valid still if the cancer is still in its early phase, limited time frames we look at, there's no restriction on resources. But if there are restrictions on resources, we can then use a second growth laws, for example. So Gumpert's tumor growth came up in the 60s and said, okay, we have this additional function, logarithm of carrying capacity times divided by the size of the tumor to account for resources in the body being limited. Cancer can't grow larger than a certain threshold. So these two differential expressions are quite nice because they have solutions, but you can also put in there other growth laws if you like. The second part we want to model is the metastasis spread, and here we don't model yet the spatial resolution, we just model the number of metastases. So we have some number which is there at the time point of diagnosis, and then we have a inhomogeneous Poisson process, so just a counting process, counting the number of metastases, and the intensity rate for this process now depends on time and on the size of the tumor. So there's the first combination we take into account. If we then look at the likelihood later, we will see, okay, this is quite a nice formulation, because what we can say is that if the probability of some number n new metastases in a certain time interval is just a PDF of Poisson process, and this PDF has this accumulated density here, so the only assumption we need on our model is that this integral somehow exists. So we need to have a nice functional intensity rate that can be integrated over time intervals. And the third process, not the third process, but the examples for this would be really the most simple thing you can think of, just a volume-based metastasis intensity. We have a base parameter plus some parameter times the function of the size of the tumor. In this case, square root can also be something else. Square root just showed some nice robust behavior. And then we also see that dependent on the size of the tumor or the tumor growth law, we get different trajectories for our metastases. There's also a bit more sophisticated method in thinking about metastasis expressed. So for metastasis to be able to successfully invade a new environment, it needs to be highly mutated. And mutation of cells can only occur if cells divide. So we can also think about expressing the rate for metastasis to be successful in a new environment to depend on the number of cell divisions, which is just the logarithm of the number of cells. So volume of the tumor divided by volume of the single cell divided by logarithm of 2. This obviously nothing we came up with. It's used in cancer literature, but we can also insert this into our model, and then we also see different trajectories. If we just take an exponential tumor growth law and then different metastasis growth laws, metastasis spread laws, then we get different trajectories for that. And the third process is the patient survival. So for the patient survival, the thinking was, okay, now this patient survival should depend on the size of the tumor as some integrative measure, how far our disease is already developed, and the number of metastases. As I said, metastases kind of pose a threat on organs, and this causes a lot of death. So we really want to take this correlation into account. And since cancer patients mostly die because of the disease and not because they are already old, we also can say that given we survived until some time point, the survival of the next sometime really does not depend on how long we already survived. So this is kind of the memoryless property, and this translates then in mathematics to the exponential distributed survival times. So when we look at the probability to survive until some time, it's again involve exponential function over this accumulated intensity rate. So again, we need some assumption that this death intensity rates are integrable over time intervals. You can think then of the death process as a Poisson process, which just stops after the first jump. Because if the cancer patient is dead, the process stops. But we have, and then it's again a Markov process, which is mathematically speaking quite nice. But just thinking about Poisson process stopping it after one jump. And as a simple example in this work, we then consider just really the most simple thing we could do, a parameter times the size of the tumor plus a parameter times the number of metastases. And if we then put in, for example, different tumor growth laws, we get different Kaplan-Meier curves, so different survival probability curves for our patients. So then we said, okay, now we need to look at all three of them combined. So our picture from the beginning would then be fill up. Let's say we have a continuous growth process, we have a Poisson process for metastasis number and a Poisson process for the death. And then we were thinking, okay, now we can formulate this, we can simulate this, and then we want to leverage data. So what kind of data we will leverage there is just, okay, we have some irregular, they look quite equidistant here, they are, but in practice they're not. So some irregular time points and at which we observe the size of a tumor, because there might be some screenings, there might be radiological data. We will observe the number of metastases, and here it's quite the first tricky part, is that we just observe the number of metastases at some time points. We don't observe when this jump happens, so when does the new metastasis occur. So the time points are really uninformative, except for the last one, because what we also assume to observe is the death time point. I mean, if a patient dies, you will recognize quite fastly, quite quickly. So these are the three processes. Then we said, okay, and this S, N, and D now make just one vector X, and this is our process. We are looking at our combined stochastic model. In practice, then, what one wants to do is we have now a model formulation, which involves a lot of parameters, intensity rates, and so on, and we then really want to find out what are these parameters for different patients. So we want to do some parameter inference. And for this to be efficient, because a physician doesn't want to wait 2 weeks for results, we thought like, okay, the most efficient way we can think of is really formulating a likelihood function. So when we look at this, it's kind of a hidden Markov model what we have. If we discretize it over time, all processes are Markov processes, so we can look into the formulation of a likelihood for a hidden Markov model. And what we then want to say, if we have a data set consisting of L patients, we really want to get the marginal likelihood for each patient, so marginalizing out our hidden dynamics. The first one are assumptions on the observational model, for example, additive Gaussian noise on the tumor size because we have measurement errors or so on. So this is kind of model choices we can make. And then the last part, we can, for each patient, again, split over time points. And what we really left with is this transition laws. We need to somehow write down what is the state of the patient at the next time point, given we know what it is on this time point, and then you can do a bunch of calculations, and we have this process formulation. It's really nice, and at the end it comes to these nice, ugly nested integrals. So they're really nasty nested integrals, as I like to call them. And the idea behind these integrals for the death process is, okay, since we don't observe when the metastasis is there, we just see, okay, we have m new metastases, we now need to integrate over all possible time points at which these metastases could have occurred with times the probability that they occurred exactly in this order at this time point, and so on. And this gets quite challenging, I would say. But at least we could formulate a formula for the likelihoods depending on all these weights being just functions that are integrable. So we then said, okay, let's do simulation study. I showed you some examples of processes we wanted to consider for the simulation study. So we took 3 models, precisely the exponential proportional model. We have the exponential tumor growth times our volume-based metastasis, the cell division model where we changed the metastasis spread now by this division-based, and there we already see for this exponential tumor growth, our number of cell divisions gets quite a nice formula because just beta times time divided by logarithm of 2. And the last one is the Gompertz model, where we exchange the exponential tumor growth by the Gompertz growth with the volume-based metastasis intensity. And for all 3 processes, or for all 3 models, we just took the same simple example for the death intensity. And the first result for that is, and I found it quite nice when I discovered it, because I did a lot of calculations, we get analytical likelihood formulations for the first 2 models. This is quite nice. Of course, I didn't get them by hand, writing down pages of pages. Mathematica get them. And I can tell you just like one equation for m equals 5 is 3 pages in a LaTeX document. So it's quite nasty, but we get them. And this means we have a nice speed up. Speaking about Mathematica and implementation, maybe a first side remark. The implementation of simulation optimization is, of course, done not in Python, but in Julia. Otherwise, I would not be standing here. And for this, it's quite nice to use Julia, and it was our first choice because we could express differential equations in this nice SciML ecosystem. We could write our own simulation algorithm for jump processes and then use Julia's modularity to combine them nicely. This works really, really well. And for the optimization, we hard-coded the analytical expressions, or ChatGPT does. We approximated the nested integrals if we don't have the analytical expression by a cubature package, so by some adaptive quadrature rules. And then if we have forwarded working on our expressions, we could use LBFGS. If not, we could use simulated annealing, both for the optim.jl package to do the parameter inference, so optimizing our likelihood function. Here's also a side arrow because for some of these expressions, they involve functions which are not able to get derivatives with forward-diff, unfortunately. And then we can also do this quite in parallel. So we saw we can split over patients, so we can do the likelihood calculation for each patient in parallel to speed things up further up. And Julia does it automatically, or we use distributed. So it's really a nice task for Julia programming language here. Okay, now getting to some result figures, actually. Since we're in systems biology, we like figures, so I will show you some. The first thing we needed to make sure is that our analytical likelihoods and the numerical ones, like a sanity check, they agree with each other, and of course they do, otherwise I would maybe not show it to you. And then we also saw that analytical likelihoods are really, really giving us an efficiency gain. So for the exponential proportional model, this efficiency gains is nearly 2 orders of magnitude. So it goes from some microseconds to like microseconds for the analytical times to microseconds for the numeric times for one evaluation, so it's really a gain. For the cell division-based model, there we have not such a huge gain, but still, this is due to involves an upper incomplete gamma function, which is also under the hood approximated numerically in Julia, so we don't get this huge gain. We also don't get gradients, but still 5 times faster is quite a thing if you want to do this for a lot of patients. Obviously, this then translates also into optimization. So we use the simulated annealing on the numeric and the analytic likelihoods and the LBFGS if we have gradients. And then if you look at the optimizer traces, we really see how they cut down, like from going 10,000 seconds, so nearly 2 hours, to like 10 seconds for the exponential proportional model, which is quite nice because then you can do a lot more stuff in practice than just always waiting. For the cell division model, we don't have gradients, so we don't get the huge speed up. We're working on the gradients here. But still getting nearly 1 order of magnitude means like really reducing the time we have to wait. Obviously, all the likelihoods calculations are nice and efficiency gain is great, but if the results are not correct, we don't do anything with them. So we really wanted to show that we get accurate estimates, and what you can see here, we also did some sampling to get confidence intervals for our maximum likelihood estimator. And what we saw, which is quite nice, is that all these confidence intervals always cover the true values we put into our simulation study for the 5 parameters involving in the rate and the growth for the exponential proportional model, and also for the cell division model we got this nicely accurate parameter estimate. So it's kind of a working framework. Then another thing we were thinking about is, okay, now in practice we don't really know which law is really accounts for the metastatic seeding in the patient, so we wanted to do some kind of model selection. So we simulated forward exponential tumor growth laws twice the same, and then put the volume-based or the cell division-based metastasis process on that to get 2 different metastases curves, and we chose parameters to be like that also the death process gives us really similar Kaplan-Meier curves, so the only difference in the data sets is really in this metastasis processes, and then we fitted both models to both data sets to see can we identify which model is accounts for which data set, so which data set is created with which models, and we can, because if we then calculate the AKIK information criterion and we take the difference, we see that for the proportional data, the proportional model is the better one, and for the cell division data, the cell division model is the better one, and by quite some difference. So normally you say it's statistically significantly different if it's more than 10. We're ending up with 300 or 1,000. So it's really quite sure, okay, this is the data which, or this is the dynamics which accounts for this data, which is quite nice. You can do the same simulation for the tumor growth laws, but using ODEs, this is not that interesting now, but when we switch to SDEs, this will be more interesting. And the last one, we can also use more complex models. Of course, having this approximation via numerical integration schemes, we can also use a complex tumor growth, and then we can do all the same stuff. We don't see speedups here because we don't have analytical likelihood. It's just not possible to get this nested integrals done. But we can see, okay, our optimizer, they converge nicely after some time. They all converge to the same point, and we get accurate parameter inference. So we get accurate maximum likelihood estimators with confidence intervals which cover the true values. So it's also possible to exchange this by more complex models. To sum this part a bit up is, okay, we now have a kind of novel approach for modeling a cancer patient with taking into account these 3 processes which are all correlated and combined, and we do not rely on structured data, so we just sampled on random time points for these different processes. We can compute analytical likelihoods in certain model formulations, and if available, they really increase our efficiency. But if not, we can still use the modeling framework to do inference tasks. It is sensitive to model choices, and we can try to use it to identify underlying dynamics, and it's quite flexible, and we can accommodate various complex model formulations. Of course, this is not the end of the story, but just the first, like I would say, first steps we want to do, and the next even harder steps are then to include covariates. For example, one can think then just adding on this intensity rate some covariate vectors. We really also want to do individual parameters per patient, so really have this somehow maybe functional as in a mixed effect model, being depending on an individual part for each patient being different and a common population parameter. If we did this, we really want to switch to SDEs, or we're already trying to SDEs. So, for example, geometric bound motion as being the SDE counterpart to the exponential growth law, or the SDE counterpart to the Gampert's growth law. But by switching to the SDEs, we don't have analytical likelihoods anymore. I mean, happy if anyone knows how to integrate overall path of a Brownian motion, then I take this. But if not, then we need to think about, okay, how can we like smart and maybe a bit tricky approximate these likelihood formulations. So we still really want to use as much analytical likelihoods as we can, because this gives us efficiency, but then we need to rely on some approximations. So what we already did there is, for example, we then approximated stuff by means or by diffusion bridges and their means and so on, which is working, but yeah, not perfectly yet. And then at the end, we want to use the data we get from our collaboration partners at the university clinics to really see how can we explain this data with our modeling framework. So still some steps to come, and if anyone has comments or suggestions for any of these steps, I'm really happy to take this. Otherwise, thank you a lot for your attention. You can find me. Feel free to contact me after the session or about the conference.
Okay, there are a few questions. The next speaker can already put their laptop there. The mic will come.
Thank you very much. You said that those analytical likelihoods meant a huge speed up, but also you said that they are like 3 pages of document. I think it's probably not trivial to have such a long formula and implement it efficiently. Was it any challenge, or was this just straightforward?
Well, I wrote a function in Mathematica, like Mathematica exports stuff in Fortran code, and I wrote a function that exports this into Julia code, and this was quite trivial then to do.
Okay, and like, so I mean...
And then you need to like look on them and add some commas there, like put some plus there, but it was not that bad, actually.
Okay, but I assume that maybe like evaluating certain sub-expressions in a certain order then matters, and so you didn't have to do anything by hand in this regard.
Not that much, really. Just like, I mean, you need to do by hand stuff like that. You need to identify parts where if you might divide by 0 if you go into low number regimes and so on. And we added some log transformations, but it was really nicely getting the Julia code from Mathematica. So I can really, yeah, I don't know, say that Mathematica is nice there.
Okay, yeah, nice. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the talk. You said you coded your simulation functions yourself with modified intensity functions. Any reason why you didn't use jumpprocesses.jl from SciML?
Yes, long story short, the results were not reliable and correct. I did use SciML there and combined this, and they have a really nice interface there. But then I couldn't get the inference running and for months, and I was like, okay, what happened? And then I went back to simulation and wrote an Euler scheme and this modified next reaction method, and both agreed in the data they produced, but they were different from the SciML one. I have an issue which I will open as soon as I will publish this code and submit this work. I don't know why it doesn't work, really. I really appreciate, I can show you later and really discuss it with you, because I would really appreciate to use this framework, but as soon as you add the second jump process, something happens that it doesn't give an error, but the results are not correct.
Thanks for the talk. Regarding your inference scheme, I'm wondering if you have considered using some kind of simulation-based inference approach, something like a amortized method.
We did, but as long as you have some parts of the analytical likelihood available, our experience in the group was that it's way faster, and so we really changed to getting analytical likelihood formulations with our work. But yeah. It's obviously, if we go to the SDEs, something part we will consider.
Okay, thanks for your talk. My question regarding the start of your talk, so you started with this big vision that you have, but then you went into analytical likelihoods. I'm just curious, why do you spend all this time trying to do this while you know it probably won't scale to more difficult problems? Yeah, thanks.
Well, from my personal view, I think it's always nice to have a starting point where you really can start working, not try to capture the big picture and then like standing in front of a wall when you go climbing and trying to climb that wall and you start to jump doesn't help. So you really start to search for these little knees where you could put in your fingers and then start climbing up. As I said, we extend this now by covariates, individualized parameters, and then we don't get the analytical likelihoods, but doing these computations already gives a lot of insights about how these processes are connected and how the structure is, so which parts we might get analytically available and which parts we might need to approximate and then how to connect them. So I think it's still good to start there at the basement. But yeah, good question.
Okay, we'll stop questions here. Thank you again for your talk.
Thank you very much.
Let's applaud the art.